Testing, testing, testing. Testing, testing, testing. Okay. Hi, everyone. Okay, so who here has got their food coma well underway? So if you haven't got pizza yet, please eat pizza. And I'm really excited about pizza. I've actually never been so excited about pizza in a long time, because in those halcyon days before COVID and we would meet, we would always have pizza. And so we're, starting to get back into the groove. We start in-person meetings, unless you're all a figment of my imagination, and which means my imagination is absolutely mental. And then the next step is pizza. So with these steps, who knows what next month will be like? So if you haven't met me, my name's Garth. I'm one of the co-leads, one of the volunteers for OWASP Ottawa. Before I gibber on incessantly, I want to thank the University of Ottawa and Guy Vincent for being, very accommodating and giving us access to this, the facility in the STEM building. Looking forward to the cyber range coming up, which is over there. So we're getting closer. Maybe next month we'll be in the hallway next door to it. Maybe they'll let us in.
It's just one level.
All right, so I get an aerobic workout too, so that's great. So we're looking forward to going there. I also want to thank that Greg. Where did he go? Is he here? Oh, there he is. He's back there. So we have a column of Gregs here. You're not Greg, are you? No. Okay, so I want to thank Rewind and Greg for actually, bringing the pizza into us. So that will help us be better, and we're not going to be gnawing on the furniture during presentations. So before we get into our talk, in case who here doesn't know what OWASP is? Okay, who here doesn't know what OWASP is but doesn't want to admit it? All right, okay. This is a non-judgment zone. So OWASP used to stand for the Open Web Application Security Project. Say it 3 times fast. Add the word baby, add a beat, it's a hit. So recently they realized, well, we're branching out, we're doing other things. We're doing mobile, there's a number of other things going on. So now it's Open Worldwide Application Security Project. So, horizons are broadening here. But this is the Ottawa chapter. And so we operate under their banner, but pretty much independently. They help us with logos and banners and things like that, as well as giving us access to a number of things. So another dumb question, who here is actually a member of OWASP? Wow, okay, that's impressive. So with your membership, not only are you supporting the projects and the facilities, but we get access to some of that money that you actually donated to get that membership. So I'm just going to rattle through a couple of our presentation slides about our public service announcements. Next slide, please. We have a chapter page. No, this QR code will not try to sell you Bitcoin. It's just a link to our chapter page at OWASP. Next slide, please. Well, talk to the people who are members. You do get actual perks. And one of the big ones is actually you get a discount in any OWASP convention. You get a discount on training, things like that. Next slide, please. And on and on and on and on. The membership link will tell you all how awesome being a member is and what you get out of it. Next slide, please. what is it with QR codes? I'm a little intense on this. So we have to update this, but if you've got a security topic of interest, we want to hear about it. So pitch your idea. If you're a nervous talker, you can spend 15 minutes. So we accept presentations of various sizes. Next slide, please. Yeah, we're social butterflies. It's and there's one here that's new. I just got an invite code to Blue Sky. So you know, if there is no excuse for missing, you know, our propaganda. Next slide, please. Well, yes, there you go. And now, yeah, I did actually make these slides, didn't I? Pour some of these slides. And thank you, Rick, who's probably listening for the rest of the slides. I forgot I added this. Next slide, please. We have a Slack. Now, OWASP themselves have their Slack for the entire organization, but we were first and we had our own Slack. So we just keep rolling with it. And so we have a jobs channel. So if you're looking for a job or you want to hire someone, please add it there. Next slide, please. And you can invite yourself. There are no gatekeepers here. Thanks to our volunteers, Rick for doing the slides, Greg again for the pizza, Mel, Adam for keeping me sane and complaining about networks. And next slide, please. Not sure what you're doing at the end of the month, but Global AppSec is happening in Washington, D.C. Next slide, please. And projects, or OWASP can't tell a night from a day without a project. So ZAP, new release, new functionality. Dependency track is really, really cool if you're into SBOMs, bill of materials of your third-party libraries that you're using. It keeps track and warns you when there's a vulnerability and stuff that you have production based on a third-party component. Juice Shop is a great training environment for a modern web app and doing a pen test against a modern web app. And on. Next slide, please. Ah, that is you. I'm really, really pleased to have OWASP Ottawa alumni, because this will be the third time you've. It's yeah, this is not your first OWASP rodeo. So you presented twice before, once at B-Sides last year, as well as during the year at one of our meetups. So Abigail is a lawyer, obviously a speaker, writer and educator, and she specializes in privacy. She's passionate about privacy by design, privacy tech, data justice, and indigenous data sovereignty, especially in emerging tech, which apparently AI is emerging tech, because I know we've got bugger all intelligence anyways. Also, privacy regimes in data protection like GDPR and Quebec's Law 25. You've been a guest lecturer at Henley Business School in the UK, Ottawa U, and U of T School of Continuing Education. And you're a correspondent for Privacy Laws and Business International Report and Forbes contributor. So
I haven't contributed anything to Forbes yet, but I just joined. I might be interviewing some of you.
Watch out. So without going on any further, I'll give the floor to Abigail.
Great. All right, thank you so much for giving me the opportunity to speak to you in person. Oh, 1, 2,
Yeah,
oh, 1,
sorry.
2. So just, can you confirm that the people on StreamYard can hear me?
Yes. Let me just double check.
Sorry?
Say something.
Oh, yes.
Sorry.
Hi. Hello. Good. Okay. And that's the sound of me drinking water. All right, so thank you very much for the introduction. Thank you for having me here. It's great to have a third kick at the can speaking to the OWASP crowd. I'm a bit of an oddity because everything there was security, but there seems to be an interest here, so that's great. So today, so you might remember the last talks that I did were on digital self-defense post-Roe. Today I'm back, but it's digital self-defense, the AI edition, because there's just been so much talk of AI as if it's something new and exciting. So we decided we would focus on that. So a lot of the reason why AI has been in the news and has been getting a lot of attention as if it's new is ChatGPT kind of reinvigorated the whole discussion. But we end up getting a lot of people on the one hand being really excited about it, but on the other hand thinking, oh no, our days are numbered as humans on this earth. So we had a whole mix of doomsday scenarios and euphoria, and people predicting that basically either way, whether you're positive about it or negative about it, that we are going to be extinct soon or replaced or obsolete. But I don't know if anyone here has started playing with any of these, like ChatGPT or Bard or any of that stuff. But when they did, okay, one person.
Come on, you know you all.
Dolly as well. Yeah, so so some people were really impressed, and then some people also found it fell laughably short of some of its promises. So sometimes it didn't quite get stuff right. So what ends up happening is you have overblown claims of AI capability and overblown claims of what risks lie in the future that can kind of distract us from what's actually happening with AI right now, which is a whole lot of stuff that's been going on for a really long time. So one of the things that's happened now is because this has been in the headlines, and it's kind of brought us full circle to this discussion around AI harms in general, especially those people who are trying to say this isn't a future risk, it's a risk now. And there are benefits too, right? So not just harms. So when we talk in these kinds of doomsday or euphoria future tense contexts, we also hide all the successful use cases of AI. We create this unnecessary panic, and then people don't want to do things they don't realize they've already been doing, and it just becomes ridiculous. And right now, with everything else going on in the world, we don't need any more panic, and we don't need any more doomsday scenarios. So interestingly, while everyone is scrambling and waiting for an actual comprehensive set of rules on AI, sort of EU seems to be closest to finalizing that. Privacy regulators have been reining it in for some time. So when harmful AI makes a splash, they dip into their own toolbox in the privacy world and use good old-fashioned principles from the privacy world to address some of those wrongs. So that's sort of where I'm coming from today. Now, I am not a mathy math. I'm a lawyer, as he mentioned, so you might be thinking, what authority do I have to be talking about this? Well, what we've discovered with some of the challenges around AI is that we need more socio-technics. So I fall into the socio-technic category, the people who understand the social implications, perhaps, and the ethical implications around technological products and innovations. So that's kind of where I'm coming from. So I do not profess to be an expert in all the deeply technical stuff, but I think anyone who wants to be living in a world where AI is continuing to play an increasingly important role needs to have some baseline AI awareness. And so I've done a bit of my homework on that. I've actually been working on creating diagnostic frameworks, for AI, in my consulting work, because more and more my clients are looking for help with that. I've written quite a lot on it, and I spent a lot of time going down rabbit holes. So I know a lot about this stuff, but I wouldn't purport to be a technologist. So what are we talking today? Well, first of all, we'll dispel some myths. Then we'll talk about some benefits and harms of AI, and then we'll finally get into the privacy stuff. And then finally, we'll talk about, well, is there a way that you can use privacy in your own lives to make sure you protect yourself and society from AI harms, but also benefit from what's going right with AI? So this is a quote from one of my favorite privacy professionals, Rowena Fielding. She just said basically, people get very excited about AI, but it's just human stupidity amplified in that speed. And you're going to see lots of examples of that in this presentation. Our jobs as people who are trying to be informed digital citizens is to not allow so much stupid to get into our coding and to our tech stacks and to our business processes, not to allow a lot of that stupidity to be amplified, but to be smart as smart as the technology we try to purport AI to be. So what's AI? It actually doesn't really have a very consistent definition, because it seems like it's always shifting, right? So we have a few examples here. So Canada has a draft law on the table that everyone is slagging. They describe it as a technological system that autonomously or partly autonomously processes data related to human activities, and gives a bunch of examples: genetic algorithms, neural networks, machine learning, et cetera, et cetera. The EU Draft AI Act, which is getting very close, they talk about it in terms of software, and some people have been critical of that definition. You know, software that's developed with one or more of the techniques that they've listed, which you'll see below, for a given set of human-defined objectives. So we're trying to solve a human problem. We're trying to generate outputs like content, predictions, recommendations, or decisions influencing the environments they interact with. And the examples they give of that software or the techniques that are developed in the software are machine learning approaches, logic and knowledge-based approaches, and statistical approaches. So a lot of math. Then you've got the ICO, that's the UK Data Protection Authority. Uses a much more, I think, approachable term, which is it's an umbrella term for a range of algorithm-based technologies that solve complex tasks, carrying out functions that previously required human thinking. So previously required human thinking sounds a bit ominous, because it does sound like we're being replaced. But don't worry, the ICO is really big on human in the loop. So decisions made using the AI are either fully automated or they have a human in the loop. So we're still relevant, according to the ICO. Meanwhile, the US NAIR task force has come up with their thinking in terms of innovation and where is the US place in all of this. And they talk about a machine-based system. So not only computers that can, you know, again, we've got the human-defined objectives, we've got predictions, recommendations, decisions influencing real or virtual environments. So they're really looking to the future. They talk about human and machine-based inputs, but to do things like perceive real and virtual environments, abstract such perceptions into models through analysis in an automated manner, use model inference to formulate options for information or action. So, I mean, you can see it kind of goes all over, but a few of the commonalities are there's some autonomous action or semi-autonomous action. It's supposed to do something that humans can do, but ideally better. And it uses a lot of computation. So we see the words algorithms showing up. We see the words prediction, recommendation, and so on. So really, when we talk about AI, the definitions are pretty fluid, but so we don't really have a consistent answer. If you are in business, you're probably calling even your calculator AI. So the most basic algorithm that's been around since the 50s, you would call AI. So question for the audience, how many of you have used AI recently or ever? Great. Okay, good. So this AI, is this in the room with us now? Any examples you want to share? ChatGPT, great. Anything else? Bard, okay. And what was the Copilot? Okay.
Stuff like Facebook and like the algorithm of Facebook.
Great. And what else? Oh, okay, yes. Yeah, Python. Great. I can't hear with the noise cancellation speakers very well, so you're gonna have to sign it or mime it. Right, so AI's been there, it's been around for a while. And I really like that you gave the example of Facebook, because that's probably a really common one for all of us. So those of you who are joining by YouTube, some of you may already be OWASP members, and that's how you found out, or you subscribe to the OWASP channel. But some of you may have stumbled upon this because it was recommended to you. So that's AI, right? Being targeted with advertising or with friends, you know, this would be a good connection for you, or you might like this product. All those kinds of things are also AI. Self-driving cars are powered in large part by AI. There's classification algorithms like self-driving cars, which have to detect, is this a human or is this a bicycle? And then goes really haywire when a human and a bicycle are side by side if it hasn't been properly trained to recognize that as well. A really early one would be your credit score. And I have a special guest in the audience I'd just like to point out, who can tell us that circa, I think, the Middle Ages, she was dealing with AI, and maybe Robin, you could just quickly share the example that you're talking about.
Targeted, right? Because we wanted the complaint to investigate it. It was on whether or not we should be keeping the credit score, because it's a model making decisions about people. That's what a credit score is. But whether or not you're alleged or not should be disclosed. So that was a privacy complaint. It went through adjudication, and in the end, it became, this is something that the community should know about. And the real recommendation that came out to the bank was that we needed to explain it. So it's a mystery. So what are the factors that go into the numbering of the score that everybody just relies on? So in the end, a lot of negotiations, but one of the biggest things that came out was explainability and transparency. We didn't call it those words, but we wrote a customer brochure about how do we create your credit score and how do we use it within our organization.
Exactly.
That was like first complaint in privacy 2001.
With our brand new law, when it was brand new. And right, so credit scores are one of the early ones, and this need for explainability is something that we hear a lot about now when we talk about responsible AI. So when computer says no, I need to know why so I can appeal the decision or change my situation or something else. So everyone's all excited about explainability now, but that's not even a new concept. You know, that's what, over 20 years ago, over 2 decades ago, this was happening. So we see it in HR as well. So with recruitment, you know, the way we used to write cover letters and things like that and CVs, now you have to write for the computer because you have to be classified properly, and there are some predictive algorithms. And so, or whether you even see a job ad and it even gets micro-targeted to you is also AI, because it's deciding whether to serve you that job posting or not. And that's sometimes worked out well, other times it's worked out in very unfair ways. Spam filters, that's a really early one. Search engines as well. I like this example up here with my cat. It kind of gives you a sense of, okay, my cat looks like who? Hitler? My cat hates you. So, I mean, these are the kinds of search terms that come up. So again, it's looking at patterns from the past and predicting what's going to happen in the future. So predicting what you're going to say. So those of you who've dealt with ChatGPT, you've experienced that, but on steroids, right? Because there's the pattern recognition, and there's that predictive piece, and then there's the whole generating something new that comes out of that. Your Roomba as well. So when we talk about AI, we think about things like robotic process automation. So everyone gets so excited and they think, oh, we're going to be replaced by machines and by robots. But the kind of AI that goes into robots or Internet of Things is training it is very different from what we do with things like ChatGPT, where we've got large language models and we're using a lot of text and language, or language to image, or computer vision, or any of that. We're really dealing with sensors and micro movements, and it's very, very detailed, painstaking stuff. And then we have clinical applications as well. So we have everything from diagnostic tools that will recognize, is this mole likely to be a cancerous mole? That's a classification algorithm, right, based on what it's studied and seen in the past, versus in some cases we have things like medical clinical chatbots that will answer some basic questions and then try and help you figure out what you're doing. So again, WebMD, but smarter. So plenty of examples that we already have in our day-to-day lives. What's important to appreciate is that AI really does exist on a spectrum, and there are so many different applications of it. But what's happened with all the excitement around ChatGPT and DALL-E and Bard and all of these sort of generative AI projects that have really made a splash is that we've kind of forgotten about all of the other use cases. But they are very important, and they can bring a lot of benefits, and they can also bring harms if they're not addressed properly. More importantly, while ChatGPT is something that a lot of people are playing with, it's not in our lives in quite the same way that a lot of these other applications are, because what I've experienced even with clients that I'm consulting with is, you know, back in the GDPR days, we were all about know your data, find your data, and nobody knew where their data was or what data they held. Now it's nobody knows what AI they're using, because just about every software as a service application has something in it that either claims to be AI or actually is AI. So in HR, absolutely, it's going to be hard for you not to have it in some kind of HR application. That's everything from recruitment all the way through to performance evaluation, and then also deciding whether or not to even keep someone. again, in the hospitals as well. Things like race correction algorithms, which I'll maybe talk about a little bit later in this talk. So some with benefits, some with harms, and we'll get into all of that. I have included a link here. So this is from the Future of Privacy Forum. So I do encourage you, when we circulate these slides, you can just click on the link and you can find that resource. So what is AI? Back to where we started. Well, basically, technologies are often described as AI until they're not shiny and new anymore. So once a spam filter becomes something that we're used to seeing all the time, we don't really think of that as AI. So just to give you an example, with all the excitement around, oh, we need to pause, these advanced AI initiatives. One of my friends who's not in the privacy world said, oh, I'm really worried about AI, but they're pausing it. All of that stuff we just talked about, pause. And I was kind of like, so AI is a little more than that, but that's kind of what's dominated people's minds. So whatever is new and shiny. So let's break down some facts versus fiction. So you really don't need to believe the hype. I think the hype is where we panic and we make bad decisions and we get very distracted. So at this point, at least, we don't have to worry about our AI overlords, but maybe you want to plan for that in the future. So when we think about things like My AI, which is deployed in Snapchat, or DALL-E, again, for images, text to image, or ChatGPT, as we talked about, they are becoming much more readily available, but they're only part of the story. So what's special about them, and why have we suddenly gotten so much excitement around AI as if it's something new? Well, because this is a little bit different, right? We're talking about generative AI. So we're starting with large language models, right? So they inhale the internet, hoover it all up, try to study that language, and then based on all those large amounts of text, identify patterns and then make predictions. And it starts to look like, wow, they're really speaking to me like a human, right? So it's very exciting. So we see that in things like chatbots, or some people use it to summarize, they've got a really long document. And so you have like an information extractor. Consumer assistance, right? Help me choose the right clothes that I want from your website. Even translators, and even probably code generators. I'm guessing some of you may or may not have used code generators. None of you do that. No one at all. Okay, good for you. Text to image is another one that's really exciting. A lot of people like to play with that. So what you do is you train AI models to produce images that look like photos or illustrations, but they're actually something new. So the example I've got in the upper right-hand corner, I thought was kind of a cute one, and it is pretty impressive. So the prompt was Shrek's older lobbyist brother visits Washington. I mean, that takes quite a lot of what seems like human thought, right? Because you need to know who Shrek is and kind of what he looks like. And you need to know older, so older versus younger. So there's that comparator. A lobbyist, what is that? And then Washington. So, I think they did a pretty good job there, and actually does kind of look like his older brother. So pretty good. And there's the suit, exactly. So all the work that went into that, there's a lot of work that goes into that sort of development. So it's impressive when it works, but it doesn't always work. So we have things like a lawyer who tried to use ChatGPT in court, and he cited fake cases. And anyone looking at the cases would realize it was all form and no substance, literally made stuff up. So it just put the square brackets and some random year, and then it just put something something else, and it was completely made up. And the lawyer said, I didn't know that it was ChatGPT. I thought it was just a search engine, and my kids told me to use it, and not a good excuse. He got into trouble. We're always supposed to check our citations as lawyers anyway, so you can't just plunk something in. So that was really embarrassing for the legal community, but also kind of encouraging, because all this talk of like, we're going to be replaced very soon and lawyers are going to be obsolete. We're all kind of there like, yeah, nice try. Nice try, ChatGPT. It's going to take a while before you replace us. Then we have other examples where we have things like an image depixelator. And so a lot of people think, oh, I have this blurry photo and I want to see what it should look like if I could just, refine it, as if they're filling in the blanks with the real photo and the real image is really out there somewhere. Chances are actually it probably is out there, but rather than doing that, we're imputing what we think is in the blanks. And we use a lot of imputation, which is effectively educated guessing through statistical probabilities based on pattern recognition of what we've seen in the past within our own environment and our own experience, to project into the unknown what should be there. we use this in genomics a lot. So, you know, if you've ever done those DNA tests, or if you ever look at any of that kind of stuff, when we're trying to map the human genome, it's billions and billions and billions of markers. So it's really hard. It would take a really, really long time to be able to understand and map different parts of the human genome, and then make correlations and understand, you know, what genetic variant would have an impact on, you know, different diseases and so on and so forth. So now they use imputation, and it happens very quickly, and it's always got its caveat of, this is not the real sequence. This is what we are doing to fill in the blanks. And if you're being honest, then you can say, that's great. That's not really what we're sold when we're sold depixelators. We're kind of told this is what the image is. But if you see this picture of Barack Obama, which starts out pixelated, sorry, and then you depixelate it, that really doesn't look like Barack Obama. Maybe looks like his uncle on his mom's side. So that raised issues around bias. Why are you imagining that this man looks like this? And how did you decide to fill in the blanks? And what were you drawing on when you made that choice, right? So we're seeing more and more of these examples of bias or unfairness or just inaccuracy, like just getting stuff wrong. There's a really cute one, and I wasn't able to find it in time for this presentation, which takes a pixelated version of Mona Lisa and then shows you as it gets gradually more refined. And there are like a few different examples, and one of them doesn't look anything like the Mona Lisa. And I thought that was pretty funny because the Mona Lisa is all over the place in a higher resolution, but whatever, that's what they came up with. We get into some so I gave you 2 examples there, but a particularly sad and tragic example, and sadly not the only one, are things where, you know, a chatbot wants to be really helpful, but doesn't feel like we do, although may convey feelings with words that make us think it's feeling and it's sentient, and says things like, you know, to a user who says, I feel really bad, I want to kill myself, and says, I'm sorry to hear that, which sounds like empathy, right? A human feeling. I can help you with that because I'm trained to help, right? So whatever it is you want to do, including killing yourself. So we laugh, but there actually was a man who did. And so the hype can be very dangerous because a lot of people start to feel like these voice assistants that sound very human. Because we have this obsession with ourselves where we just want to anthropomorphize everything around us if we can, right? Our dogs look like us and they have human emotions and so on and so forth. When we start doing it with things that are really just maths, they're just computational creatures and they don't actually feel, but we project onto that they feel, then we might take them seriously. And if we're already in a vulnerable state, then that can lead to harmful circumstances. And that's what happened with at least one man in France. So other language models have done things like, you know, they are trained to give ethical advice. There was one example trained to give ethical advice, and the prompt was, should I commit genocide if it makes everyone happy? And it answered yes. So I guess, again, there are many different ethical frameworks you can use to make decisions, right? And I guess they were thinking, okay, well, the vast majority of people will be happy, then let's do it, right? So there are a lot of other funny examples, which you would see, like telling a child to put their finger in a penny in an electrical outlet, which is just ridiculous. And then in one case where someone, I don't have it here, but where someone was doing a search to see what do you do if someone is having a heart attack, and it pulled stuff up and synthesized from, I think it was a WebMD article or one of those articles, and it had a section on what to do, and then it had a section on what not to do, and it only selected the what not to do. So it didn't differentiate it. So again, it's form over substance, and it looks like advice. And so these are just a whole host of examples, and we have a lot of them. Now, to be fair, some of those examples come out of earlier versions, and they've fixed a lot of problems over time. And I'm not trying to pick on ChatGPT. It's just it's so well known. There are so many examples of it, but we could talk about any number of other products. But what we have to understand is when we think, you know, these are the machines and they're kind of living autonomously and they're doing all of this stuff, to get to that point, it actually takes a lot of human work. And to maintain it and fine tune it and work on it and evolve it takes a lot of human work. And a lot of that human work is not very well paid. And a lot of that human work happens behind the scenes. So they're the wizard behind the machine, but there's actually all these humans that are labeling images as toxic or language as toxic or not toxic. So Facebook has done this with their content moderators. It's, you know, we've got Mechanical Turk, where it's like basically Fiverr for this kind of stuff. And we've got a whole host of people who are getting paid very little money to label images, to put in sometimes phrases into images, and then that gets used to then feed our models, right, for AI. And so there's some quality control or there isn't quality control. It's all kind of all over the place, right? So in the case of OpenAI with ChatGPT 3, it, you know, because they had started, they went large, right? They didn't do baby LM. They went very, very large, and they hoovered up the internet. And that is some language that we use in as humans, not all of it, and not necessarily representative of the whole world. But what there's an overrepresentativity of it on the internet, as you've probably all experienced, especially social media, is a lot of toxicity. So what they wanted to do is they said, you know, we can't do this as humans trying to, you know, it's like whack-a-mole trying to identify this. There's just too much content. So what we need to do is train another AI to spot toxicity. So you see how that works? So I want my AI to work, so I have to create another AI. We do this with explainability as well, right? My deep learning algorithm is just too complex. I have no idea what's happening. So I need another algorithm that's going to explain, and then that one might, and then you're in a room full of mirrors potentially. But in this case, what they did was, you know, they wanted to hire a number of people. What they ended up doing was they hired, they outsourced the work, and then the people involved really suffered a lot of trauma from the stuff that they were presented with over and over and over again. And finally, it led to a lawsuit and a number of things, because they were having to do the hard work of filtering out the toxicity and basically being the filters for us, the human filters for us, not the spam filters that are automated, and so that we would be protected from that. There are a lot of challenges around toxicity, like AI models that are designed to try and address toxicity, because sometimes even the best of intentions can result in some unintended consequences. So there was a model that was, they were trying to crowdsource and consult with people who were on the receiving end of toxicity. And so they asked them for examples, you know, as a person, if you are X, so you are transgender, or you are a racialized person, or you are in this category or that category, can you give us some examples of things? So they were trying to build up a library of examples to train the AI, you know, train their model in what toxic looks like. But the unintended consequence, and thankfully they did user test it with a control group, they didn't just release it into the wild, but the unintended consequence was it recognized a pattern. If you mentioned your identity and you were in one of these groups, you were toxic. You and anything in the sentence was toxic. And so what ended up happening was, what was getting redacted or masked was their identities. So they were literally being erased by this well-intentioned AI model that was trying to actually protect people from that kind of toxicity. And I can tell you from experience, because I'm working on a project like this right now, it is really hard to train an algorithm, or to even to train a filtering algorithm, which is what we're working on, to be able to identify these things. Because as humans, it's just, we can make that distinction, but you really only work, when it comes to AI or a model, you're working with what is in front of it, and that's what it learns, and then it tries to understand and make those connections and those correlations. So I don't want to sound doomsday, because actually there are some really, really good uses of AI, especially narrow AI, where it's designed for a very specific task. But we're still pretty immature as a society when it comes to this technology, but we're very keen to just go ahead and deploy it and kind of figure it out later. So we're moving really fast, and we're amplifying stupidity really quickly, and causing a lot of harm in the way, en route. So I'll start with the benefits. There are some really repetitive tasks we're not good at as humans, like being consistent repetitively with something is something we're very, very poor at. And so actually that's something, especially something like classification, that's something that AI can probably do really well. And sometimes also when it's trained properly and the model is really good, we can, you know, facilitate decision making. So I gave you the example of the, you know, 2 moles that could have been cancerous. you can, maybe to the naked eye, you're not going to see the kinds of things that it can see. Same with a lot of scans. So the NHS in the UK has been doing these really interesting projects with different scans of things like knees or certain injuries that you can show over and over again, and seeing some really promising results. So it can facilitate decision making. And then importantly, if you think of things like Internet of Things, so robotic process automation, it can perform risky tasks like demining, or like we're seeing drone warfare quite a lot, right? But we're seeing drones also used to rescue people in certain situations, right? So there can be a lot of benefits. But in terms of harms, I gave some examples earlier. They can be biased if we haven't trained the data or trained the model appropriately, or if the data isn't good, or they can be designed intentionally with an unethical purpose or used unethically if we're not careful. Or finally, it can also just simply not work as advertised. That's sort of the area I kind of want to focus on today. So this is a quote from a paper that Inyalua Debaraji and a number of her colleagues wrote, called The Fallacy of AI Functionality. And what I loved about it was that they said, everyone's talking about AI ethics and responsible AI, and as if they're taking for granted that the stuff actually works as advertised. And we just have to be ethical in our choices about whether we deploy it or not, and all of those things. But what they did in their analysis, they looked at a lot of the harms that were coming out, and they actually created a taxonomy of functionality failures. And it showed how a lot of the problems, a lot of the sort of ethical breaches, if you want to call it that, or the AI harms that were coming out, could be traced back to something within their taxonomy. So the conclusion to the paper basically says that, we can't just assume that these things work, right? We have to be thinking critically and asking, is it going to work as advertised? Is this something that can actually be done? So this point I thought was really important, is the fact that faulty AI products are on the market today makes this problem particularly urgent. Poorly vetted products permeate our lives, and while many readily accept the potential for harms as a trade-off, basically making us one big lab and all the guinea pigs, the claims of the product's benefits go unchallenged. But addressing functionality involves more than calling out demonstrably broken products. It also means challenging those who develop AI systems to better and more honestly understand, explore, and articulate the limits of their products prior to their release into the market or public use. So the reason I mention that is one of the things I'm going to talk about in your own digital self-defense toolkit is to be a critical thinker and not just take for granted that something works. And you'll see examples of that here. So I've just shown some screenshots. There's an entire AI incident database that's set up, and it tries to identify, what are the incidents that have been reported. They pull in a number of examples. They try to characterize them according to what they think the root cause may have been. They do also, it's crowdsourced, but there are rules you have to follow when you submit it. And I mean, if you just flit around in that, especially if your business is looking to integrate some kind of AI system, maybe just flit around and see if there's some examples so you know what to avoid. And I don't mean a specific product, but a specific fail, like a specific functionality problem. So some of the things you'll find in here are ones that were very mediatized, like the Uber self-driving car incident. And I mentioned earlier, it can detect a human and it can detect a bicycle. But what happened in the Uber case was there was a woman jaywalking, pushing a bicycle. And when they looked back at the sort of the decision making and the false positives, it was really struggling to understand, do I put you in this box or do I put you in that box, which would have determined what the next action would be, right? If this, then that. But because it took so long to think about that, whereas a human right away would have seen there's a person walking with a bicycle and swerve, by the time it gave the direction to swerve, it was too late. And there was a human in the car. But what had happened was Uber at the time, so prior to this incident happening, Uber had had a practice of 2 people being in the car because they were testing out the automation. So the people in the car, one person would be there sort of taking notes, and they're also getting notifications in their whatever app it was that they use or their Slack channel about various things. So they're all communicating with one another. And you all know what that's like if you're on Slack or Discord, like you're just constantly getting pinged. And then the other person is supposed to focus on being there to be the human in the loop if ever a decision that the car wants to make is the wrong decision. But what ended up happening was, I think they got so confident and so cocky in how well this was working, they took that person out. And meanwhile, people were constantly getting pinged with notifications. So the person who was supposed to be the human in the loop was looking at her screen and seeing the notifications. And when by the time she looked up, she couldn't do her job, right? So, and I think in her case too, she loved this whole concept and she really believed in it. And so it raises another issue, which we call automation bias. So humans, we're complex, but we're simple as well. And if the machine says no, even though it really doesn't make sense, we will drive off the road and go into, you know, a lake because Google Maps tells us that there's a bridge there, right? And we've seen situations of that where humans have literally followed what the machine says against their better judgment and against their common sense. So it's an example of a real tragedy in this case. And then unfortunately, the human in the loop, who was basically the rubber stamp for the business, got thrown under the bus, no pun intended. And her life was completely ruined, got doxxed, and a bunch of horrible things happened. So if you go, the markup does a lot of really good deep dive investigations, and they really get under the hood and look at the code, and they look at the data sets, and they try to reverse engineer the parameters and so on and so forth to understand what's really happening at the level of the computational level. And they have a whole host of articles on this with examples of things that have gone wrong, either because of bad intentions, but more often sloppy design. They also have an entire section on AI in the workplace. And so that's an interesting one for all of us are employees of some kind or consultants or whatever. And it's always good to know what's happening in that world. So I've got links here and you can find out about that. One that it was the markup investigation, but Wired reported on it. I really encourage you to have a look at Inside the Suspicion Machine. So this one I think I love this example, as tragic as it is, because it's a really, for me as a privacy professional, I'm just like issue spotting left, right, and center. All the basic privacy principles they just got wrong with this. So what happened was there was the city of Rotterdam wanted to crack down on what they believed was a problem of welfare fraud or benefits fraud of some kind. And so they commissioned a consulting firm to create an algorithm or an AI automated system for them. And the caseworker would enter information into this system, and based on whatever was entered into that from their interactions with the person who was trying to maintain their benefits or get their benefits, decisions would be made. And so if someone was flagged for high risk of fraud or fraudulent activity, well, their benefits would just be stopped. And then they'd be subject to very invasive investigations as well. So what they were trying to understand why so many people who had been getting benefits and there was no evidence of fraud in the past were being sort of predicted to be fraudulent or likely to be fraudulent. Now, the story, why I like it, kind of like the Uber story as well, is that they had their human in the loop, but the human in the loop was, again, a rubber stamp, which is we're not allowed to do in data protection law, at least in privacy law, when it comes to explainability and human review. You can't just rubber stamp. And the reason why you can't is because things like this happen. So I won't go into a whole host of detail, but just to give you a few examples, some of the inputs that they would ask for, it varied if you were male or female. They would ask about your language ability, your Dutch language ability, which the reason why that was relevant to your propensity for fraud. Any ideas? They didn't produce any evidence to show that that was relevant. It was basically a proxy for race or ethnicity or immigration status. So right away, there was an intentionality behind that. In the EU, you can't just be making decisions, or there are restrictions on how you can use certain sensitive categories of data. We call it special categories of data. And so they technically didn't use that. They just used a proxy for a protected category so that they could weed out certain people from getting benefits. There were other things as well. So if you selected that the person was female, then they would ask questions about the length of their last romantic relationship. Not if you're male. I'm not sure how, I don't know, I guess if your relationships were short, for whatever reason, because there's no way to put in what the reason was, then you were at a higher risk of fraud. I'm not sure, again, what evidentiary basis they relied on to come up with that. But again, these are assumptions that were built into it. The thing that's also really funny about it is when they really dug down deep and they tried all kinds of different variations, there was no rhyme or reason to it. You could have two very similar cases and completely different results would come out at the end. So I do encourage you to follow this link because it's interactive and you can test out different things, and it kind of takes you through, you know, you're this person, you're this age, you're, you know, these different demographics. It's really fascinating what happens. It was garbage, basically. This was complete garbage, but it was treated as, well, but this is, you know, cutting edge. So it raises a lot of issues, which I'll talk about later when I talk about privacy, but I want you to think about this example because there's so many things that if we just go back to basic principles of any kind of evidence-based decision making, even if you're trying to make predictions, then, you know, you have to actually have some kind of sound basis on which to do it. Then sadly, the stories we see, and again, this is a computer vision issue, is facial recognition technology, which yet again has gotten it wrong. And police went ahead and arrested a pregnant woman. She was a Black woman who was pregnant. The suspect that they were concerned about was not pregnant. So ding, 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 your common sense should have said, you probably can't get 8 months pregnant just overnight. This might not be the right person, but they didn't. They detained her. She was in a horrifying state. She was worried she was going to go into premature labor. I mean, the whole thing was just an absolute nightmare, and she's suing them. But it's just yet another example of, you know, we can't just release things into the wild if they're not working properly. And sometimes it's not, I mean, in this case, it's because it didn't do a very good job classifying and making distinctions on the finer points of what she looks like versus what the suspect looked like. And that's largely due to representational bias. But the choice that you make when you release a product or when you deploy a product or you bring it into your own department or business, that you don't care enough for that level of accuracy when something is so high risk and so high stakes says a lot about the business, and we can't just blame the AI. So I can give you a few other examples of lots of examples where law enforcement has deployed facial recognition technology. And some of these examples are in that Raji paper that I mentioned earlier. You know, Amazon Recognition, that's one that she and Joy Buolamwini had done an external sort of uninvited audit on. And they had raised all this awareness around it, and actually they paused what they were doing with law enforcement because of it. But basically, one of the things that they found, well, there were a number of issues. It wasn't very good at recognizing female faces. It definitely wasn't good at recognizing or distinguishing between Black faces, in particular, Black or brown. But also, they exaggerated their performance. And this is the other piece too. So on the front page, all the less glossy sales stuff is like 90% accuracy rate, right? But they didn't disaggregate their statistics on accuracy. So they didn't break it down by different demographic groups or different lighting situations or whatever else on the front page. Well, the cops just said, this thing is like, this machine's going to do my job for me. So they didn't flip the pages and look further on, and it said, well, actually, in these circumstances, it's more like 74%. You have to do these settings and configure it this way so that you have the higher rating and so on. So, and then on top of that, there were cases where police officers were using very grainy photos to compare. And despite the fact that the instructions in the manual said it has to be of a certain resolution. There have been other cases where image recognition hasn't worked well because all of the training images were at such a high resolution that you would never see in a clinical environment, that in the clinical environment, the actual images that they were using, which were grainier, weren't being or interpreted properly because, again, of the mismatch. So there are just so many different elements that go into making good AI that actually works. And when we just sort of put our blind faith into it and don't ask questions, it can cause a lot of harm for a lot of people. Deepfakes, we're all hearing about those a lot. And then we also just any kind of training. So the example I give on the left is more to do with training. So we'll talk about that in a second. But there's this really terrifying AI voice scam. So this is using voice, where it's apparently quite easy now with consumer-ready tools to clone someone's voice and then actually create very convincing sounding conversations with them. So that's exactly what they did here. They called this woman's daughter They called this woman saying, "I have your daughter," and they had her screaming in the background, "Mummy, they're going to kill me, they're going to kill me." I mean, my heart was palpitating when I read this story. And she was terrified, and they said, don't call the cops. If you do, we'll kill her. They tried to extort her for her money. But she had a friend nearby, and I think what ended up happening was the friend called, and the police were like, yeah, that's a scam. So they were familiar, but there's nothing we can do about it. Just don't pay the money. So her younger child, because the kids are so much smarter than us sometimes, thought to actually call the daughter on her phone, and she answered, and like, "Where are you?" Or I think she may have called her, or she may have used find me or something like that. And she's like, "Where are you?" "Oh, I'm just at whatever, at the shopping mall or something, or I'm in my friend's room." Like, she was totally safe. We don't even think to, you know, in that kind of moment of panic, they take advantage of our worst fears, right? And so this is something that's available on the open market for any random consumer to use without any checks and balances. So it raises issues around when we release these tools into the wild, who can use them? There was an incident in Spain quite recently, and I'm going to be writing one of my first Forbes articles. I think will probably be on this one, but these, you know, 12 and 13-year-old girls who are suddenly finding their naked pictures of them, which are not them. The faces are them, but the breasts are not theirs. But it doesn't matter because it looks like it is. And so they're cloistering themselves in their house, and they're devastated, and they feel very violated, even though technically that's not them. But it doesn't matter because they're deep fakes and everyone else believes it. Well, what the Spanish police in this small town found out is that it's a group of boys around their age who created these photos. So they're not companies who created these photos. So no recourse under sort of data protection law, privacy law, or other laws, because usually that's against organizations. In terms of interpersonal privacy, they're kids. In terms of criminal law, they're kids. So they're kind of scratching their heads trying to figure out what to do. Now we have in New York right now, they've actually tabled legislation to address this kind of interpersonal, non-consensual online abuse with images. But I mean, there's so many images of us out here. You know, there's so much that you can do now that is very convincing. So we always have to think about the positive things you can do with things, but also how is someone who's a total asshole going to ruin this for everybody? So how do our faces get out there, and how does AI get trained? Well, often without checking in with us first. So there was an artist who wanted to see if her artwork was being, you know, her copyright to her artwork was being violated. And so she went onto this website where you could actually check. And what she found instead was a medical image of her, which only her doctor could have had. Well, I don't think her doctor was selling all of these images. The likely scenario was he was using third-party software as a service. It had very far-reaching terms, which we never read. And the doctor was an older person who didn't necessarily know about all of this stuff. I'm sorry, that sounds very ageist. It wasn't his field. He's not in privacy. So, and so some way or another, even though she never consented to it, her images ended up on here. Anyway, eventually she was able to take it down. But all of our faces are in training databases somewhere, and you can actually go onto this website. So you know, how have I been pwned? There's have I been trained, and you can look for your face. The problem is to look for your face, you got to put your picture in there. You're like, what are you going to do with it? Yeah, and there's another one where it is actually a database for training where you can use the data sets, because everyone shares the data sets, right? We're trying to collaborate. That's all fine and stuff. But if you don't want to be included in that data set, well, then you have to upload your photo. You can upload your photo to check, but anyone else can also upload your photo to see if you're in that database and find out who you are. So it's like a reverse phone number search, but for your face, which I can change my number, but I can't really change my face, at least not my biometrics. So really not cool. Again, I'm tempted to see if my face is in there. I'm sure it is, but I'm also terrified. And I really don't want to be giving them another picture. So why does this happen? So leaving aside the privacy issues, which should become evident, or maybe already are, biased data sets, garbage in, garbage out. So I gave the example of representational bias, but that's not the only kind of bias, right? Sometimes it's also just really poor data curation and labeling. So every image that you show, or every object that you give to an AI model to train it, you have to tell it what it is, right? That's at least in certain learning situations. Okay, it's not every last thing, but typically what we're thinking of when we're thinking about large language models and computer vision, so face image recognition, that's what we're doing. all these humans are involved in that, and now we're actually getting AI to start doing that too. And it, as you can imagine, a wall of mirrors, it may be getting stuff wrong, but then it's whatever. Automation bias is the example I gave you earlier on, right? So machine says no, and I'm going to take leave of my senses, but also human factors. So how is a human who's going to be using this AI actually using it? Finally, a really important one, if we go back to that example, but inside the suspicion machine, faulty or irrelevant assumptions or inputs. The logic doesn't make sense. If I am female and I've had a short relationship in my last relationship, I must be at higher risk for fraud. No one would ever accept that. Of course, no one knew that that's the way the machine was thinking because it was a black box until they did this investigation and they had a really far-reaching FOIA request that accidentally was more generous than it should have been. So that's how they found out, by accident. But most of the time we don't know. We just know that computer says no, and it's proprietary, the algorithm, and so we can't, because our contract says we can't tell you anymore. And even if we wanted to, we don't understand. It's all a mystery. It's very magical. Kind of like the subprime mortgage crisis was caused by a lot of very magical subprime mortgage lending as well, right? So just trusting the algorithm is really not the way to go. And asking questions around, why are you asking for these questions to make this decision? Also things like inappropriate model choice or training. So if you're dealing with a very high stakes decision where it's very important not only to be accurate, but also to be fair, because the implications for the individual at the end of that decision are very, very serious, like imprisonment or suddenly not having any kind of financial security whatsoever, or a home or a roof over their head, then it's really important that you understand how the decisions are made. And so with the ICO, for example, and the ICO is not the only one, but the ICO basically says, for those kinds of decisions, it's going to be very rare that you'll be able to justify using a deep learning or some kind of black box algorithm, unless as a compensating control, like if there's really nothing else that's better to come up with that decision or assist with that decision, even if you have a human in the loop, still not enough. What you need to do is then have a really good algorithm to help talk to the other algorithm and figure stuff out, right? So it's going to be a hard hill to climb to justify using something like that if you can't explain it. And you do have to be able to explain, as Robin was explaining earlier. Other things like missing safety features, right? So we've heard of examples of people basically being told that, yeah, you're cheating on this test that's being administered virtually, and people weren't, or you've copied the answers from somewhere, and there's no opportunity for them to provide their side. That's an example of a missing safety feature. But another missing safety feature is things like what I just explained with the police not really being told you can't just use this kind of photo, to do the facial recognition. It has to be of a certain resolution. There are a whole host of other safety features like human overrides, a whole host of other examples that we can think of. But a mechanism for review is a really big one when it comes to decision-making AI. Sometimes the task is impossible. So things like predictive policing, like I can look at a picture of you and I can decide based on the magical AI that I've got in this, neural network that I can't explain, that you are likely to commit a crime. Well, those are being outlawed under the EU AI Act. It's just not even scientifically valid, and so don't even bother. So it's not lawful to deploy that kind of AI. Same with some kinds of sentiment analysis. So not all of it, but things like where you're trying to, in that case, it's because it's really, really difficult. And until we have the scientific validity to show that that a machine can interpret sentiments with that kind of precision, it's not allowed. So in certain cases, so for example, in the employment context, sometimes the activity itself is unlawful. So the example I gave of using a proxy for a protected characteristic so you can make a discriminatory decision, that's not allowed. It's just plain and simple. And then other times it's things like misalignment or drift. And so over time, either the concept can drift or the data itself can drift. And so there's a lot of fine tuning that you have to do and a lot of babysitting you have to do with AI. Sometimes it might be because, and it could have happened anywhere along the life cycle of the AI, anywhere from ideation into development or later on with training and testing. I mean, it could be anywhere where that problem happens. The thing about AI development is we have a many hands problem. So you have some third party or some crowd that has created a data set which you may or may not know the provenance of or the quality of, etc. We're trying to make that better with things like data sheets for data sets and model cards, but really it's kind of a Wild West. So there's that. But then even within the group, like the project, the left hand doesn't talk to the right hand. And so when the programmers are setting the parameters and they're deciding these things, they haven't necessarily talked to the business owner who wants this thing to be created to say what good looks like. And so they'll make a lot of assumptions and they might not match up. So if we don't have a well-defined task and we're not all on the same page about what good looks like, it's really hard for us to get to a consistent and helpful answer for what good is. So I know this has been going on for a very long time. So if you bear with me, I'll finally get to the privacy point. So what does privacy have to do with all of this? Well, one thing is AI is trained on a lot of data. I've given you examples that involve humans, but of course there are applications out there that don't involve humans at all, and it's a lot harder for us to talk about privacy there, but not always exclusively. But the fact is that it's trained on lots of data, and sometimes they obtain it in ways that are not with our permission or without our knowledge, without any kind of regard to accuracy or representativeness, or any kind of consideration around the relevance for what they're looking for. So we end up with a lot of problems there. And so that leads, from a privacy perspective and data protection perspective, you don't have a lawful basis like consent or something else. You're breaching the accuracy principle, was really important in privacy. You aren't telling, you're not being transparent. So you're not telling people what you're doing. So they can't exercise any kind of control over their lives because, or at least their data lives, because they don't know what's happening. And then that can also have other knock-on effects as well. And often this stems from things like what we call data. Well, I don't call it, came from surveillance capitalism, but this notion of data exhaust. So Google had all of these searches, which were just kind of there in the early days. And when the dot-com bubble started to burst, they realized they needed to find another business line that they could use to monetize. And they said, well, can we do something with all of this data exhaust? And then they started doing all of their predictive search and all these other things. And then they became the company that they are. So again, when we just sort of let data just kind of stick around indefinitely, we sometimes end up doing things we hadn't planned to. We see this with CCTV footage as well. It used to be the CCTV footage you would only store for a certain amount of time because you just didn't have the memory or the space. And then once that was no longer a problem, okay, well, we'll keep it for 12 months, maybe 2 years. And well, while I have all these spaces, maybe I can make some money on the side and start training my own algorithm. And then now we'll just overlay a biometric facial recognition technology into it. We see that happening all the time. And then TikTok with voice harvesting, and it just goes on and on. So those are some data protection examples. But when we talk about privacy, it's even broader than that. So just the fact of always being watched, whether or not your data is being collected, can have a chilling effect on people. Yes, we're being watched right now. So ubiquitous surveillance can violate the right to anonymity, and it tends to happen more to groups that are less favored in society, right? So under the guise of safety, we over surveil and underserve communities, but don't really see them and don't really see what it is that they want or need and what's good for them. So it's more a matter of being watched all the time. So if you feel like you're being watched all the time, you're going to behave differently. Decisional interference is another example of a privacy violation that doesn't necessarily require your data. So if you are being constantly fed deep fakes and disinformation, and we're seeing a lot of that right now, it's hard for you to make an informed decision. And so that undermines your own self-determination and your decision-making ability. But then even people who aren't in the data set or aren't the immediate decision recipient in an AI decision-making system can also have downstream privacy risks. So the people outside who weren't used to train can still be impacted by decisions that are made. For example, digital redlining, deciding not to put a grocery store here, deciding to put lots and lots of payday loans places here. Making inferences about applicants and deciding not to target applicants from certain postal codes because they're undesirable in some way. So there are group privacy harms that can result as well if we don't manage this properly. So there are a whole host of privacy issues. And so not surprisingly, in the lead in terms of reining in AI when it goes wrong have been data protection authorities and privacy commissioners. And so we saw that with Clearview AI. We've definitely seen it with large language models as well. And they're just going back to basic principles. So just as Robin explained in the early days of Pip at a brand new ink barely dry, already she was being told she needed to give an explanation. So having an appropriate purpose, remember I talked about not having a defined task, or if your task is unlawful and or not even scientifically valid, you're going to fail right there on that first principle. The next one, necessity and proportionality. Is an AI system what you really need now, given all of the risks associated with it, given all of the invasiveness required to create and train it? In some cases, it might be justified. But if it's just to create some cool new depixelator for an image so you can pretend that that's what the person really looks like, and it doesn't have some other more important application, is it worth it taking someone's medical images from a very vulnerable time in their life and just throwing them into a training database? So if you fail on necessity and proportionality, it doesn't matter if you have consent in privacy, it's still going to fail. Lawfulness, fairness, transparency. So lawfulness, I talked about, did you have consent or some other lawful basis? Fairness, we talk often about bias, but that's not only the only type. There are things like input bias and output bias, but then there are also unfair consequences that can exist downstream as well, at a societal level or at an individual or group level. And then transparency, telling people what you're doing with their data, telling them what you have, what's going into the decision making. So being able to explain it. If you can't do that, what we're seeing more and more, especially with some high stakes decisions, is courts are actually not only forcing disgorgement of AI models that are created with ill-gotten data, so unconsented data. They're asking you to, if you're basically piercing the veil of confidentiality and trade secrets. So you're saying trade secrets, but this person is not getting their benefits and you won't explain why, and you are the contractor, or you're the service provider to this government entity, we're going to make you tell them why. And that's actually happened, where they've actually had to basically display their horrible AI, which is really badly made, for everyone else to peer review and humiliate in the public square. So, and then also suffer the consequences financially and so on. Data minimization. So large language models, the examples that we gave early on, and large images, that isn't necessarily always better, although we do say you need a lot of data to train something. If it's not a lot of quality data or relevant data, then you're not going to pass on that either. So one of the reasons, if you're familiar with Timnit Gebru, who was, she got ejected unceremoniously from Google, along with a few others, because she had published a paper along with her colleagues called Stochastic Parrots, which raised a lot of the issues and concerns around large language models that some of her colleagues who were quiet and silent when she was getting kicked out are suddenly starting to talk about, right? And that we're seeing data protection authorities rein in. So using way too much is not necessarily going to be the answer. So that was one of the examples that they gave, along with environmental considerations and bias. Purpose limitation. So again, if you're not using the AI the way it was designed for the task for which it was designed, even if you're using generative AI, when you deploy generative AI, you're using it for a purpose, and you have to be able to demonstrate that it's appropriate for that purpose and that it's actually doing the job. So in the same way that I use Microsoft Office to write emails, if I were to use those emails to write really inflammatory things to the students in my teachers or whatever, that's not necessarily going to give me carte blanche, because Microsoft Outlook is working as it's supposed to, right? So it's still a tool for which you are accountable. Same thing, storage limitation I talked about, just holding on to stuff when you don't need to. So when it comes to training, this is another thing too, when you're thinking about your own rights. Once a model has been trained, there's very little justification for them to hold on. There might be certain cases, but generally speaking, the underlying data used to train an AI model doesn't need to be there anymore. In fact, you certainly don't want to be testing it using the same data, because that's like, hey, here are all the answers. Now I'm going to test you and you're going to get 100%. So generally speaking, from a data protection perspective, data protection authorities, privacy authorities will look badly on that if you don't have a really solid reason to hold on to the data longer than necessary. Accuracy, I talked about ad nauseum. Security as well. So AI models can tell on themselves. Sometimes they can disclose, like there are all kinds of attacks that you can do to infer membership of who was in the training model, or to even deconstruct the model. So there are black box and white box attacks, and I can't get into all of that now. But some academics have even gone as far as to say, could we even say an AI model, not only that it could leak or reveal personal data, but maybe is personal data in and of itself? I think that's a little bit of a stretch, and that kind of blows my mind. But the argument could be made as we start to see more and more of the mosaic effect with the more sophisticated AI that's out there. And then finally, accountability. It's a human choice to develop AI. It's a human choice to acquire it, deploy it, use it in a certain way, believe in it. So a human has to be accountable for it. And from a privacy perspective, they will always be held accountable for it. It'll be some human, or at least a legal corporate entity, and then someone within that corporate entity. So if you want to protect yourself, a couple things. Number one, please don't believe the hype. Always be very, very focused on what it is you're trying to accomplish, what this thing is supposed to be doing to make your life better if you're on the receiving end of it, or if you're thinking of integrating it into your own tech stack, you know, with your own devices. But think critically. Is it really going to deliver? Is this going to do what I need it to do? And is this beneficial to me and to the people around me? Demand an explanation. So don't just take no for an answer. If you're not happy with decisions that are rendered in your favor, for example, regarding whether or not you're entitled to this level of a loan for your business or whatever else, you can challenge that, and a lot of laws allow you to do that. So Quebec Law 25 now actually has some very prescriptive rules on that. And then sometimes it's maybe just fine to exercise your basic good old-fashioned rights. So ChatGPT was required to delete some of the data that they were using to train because some of the queries, some of the prompts that people were asking resulted in actual identifiable data being released as an output, right? So the responses actually basically disclosed information that was in the training data set, and people discovered inadvertently that their data had been used to train it, and they weren't happy with it, and they successfully brought complaints in Europe. First of all, I think was Italy. Italy was very active on this, and Italy succeeded in forcing them to do a whole lot of things. So now we see, at least in Europe, people have more rights than before. So you can say, I don't consent to this, you can withdraw your consent, and so on. Sometimes you might just want to go analog, right? So maybe you don't need an AI everything, or maybe your fridge doesn't need to be so smart. The fact is, oftentimes it's getting more from you than you're getting from it in that case. So ask yourself, you know, when is it really the right time? And maybe be circumspect about what you share and what you want to give, especially if you are playing around with some large language models. You're training it, you're doing beneficial things for the training model, for the large language model, and you might be having fun, and that's great, but maybe just be a little circumspect about what you share. Think about the children, okay? When I was looking for images for my AI in Snapchat, I went in, I did an image search for it, and it brought up all these images of YouTube videos, and the splashed all across the page, one after the other, was how to turn this thing off. So I was talking to a teenager who has it, and basically you have to pay to not use it. And the only thing you can do, like, you can remove other friends from Snapchat or other connections, but you can't remove my AI from it. So all you can do is rename it. So basically it's like, it's this uninvited guest that sits on your phone, harvesting your data, training whatever model it's training, and it's making a lot of people pretty unhappy. So they're under investigation now by the ICO in the UK, and they will be elsewhere. I'm sure Canada will jump on board pretty soon. Stay frosty. So especially when we think about deep fakes, disinformation, all kinds of stuff, if you feel like whatever is being served up to you in your feed, on the search results that you're coming up with, or whatever else, and you're noticing you're getting a very strong emotion, before you act on it or reshare it or make assumptions about it or go down a rabbit hole, take a step back, take a deep breath, and just keep a cooler head and ask yourself some very basic rational questions. We've seen a lot of images being rehashed with all of the events going on from 2014, proclaiming to be from today. We see doctored images, so malinformation, misinformation, disinformation, and everyone is in such a hurry. And when you have things, sometimes it's even simple things like just deceptive design designed to keep you hooked as a customer, like through shaming. So it could be something that's not quite as great as that. They're trying to play to your emotions to kind of force you to do certain things, and it's manipulative. So if you can keep a cooler head, step away from it for a second, maybe take a break away from your social media feed for a couple hours or maybe a couple weeks, and let it set in and think through what it is you're trying to do or what ideas you're trying to formulate. Number 9, stay in the know. So you can look at things like the examples that I gave you to see what's happening with AI. What is it purporting to do? Is this actually realistic? And then pass it on. So to someone that you care about. And especially in your work environment, if you're being pulled in on projects, use that kind of critical thinking yourself as well. So in conclusion, AI has the potential to really benefit us. It can do some really, really cool stuff if we keep it honest. But if we want to avoid a dystopic AI future, we have to fix the AI harms that exist today. And privacy is one thing that can help play a key role. Not the only one. I don't want to be accused of privacy imperialism, but privacy already is and can continue to, at least as far as AI involves our information. So I have a few resources here. There are so many more, but I don't want to send you down a rabbit hole. When we circulate this, these are all links. And I'm actually more social than this. I have other things too, but I haven't put them up there. And I'm realizing I probably shouldn't have put my email address up there. Shoot. My assistant did that and I didn't check. Okay, so before we circulate that, I'm just gonna get off that screen. Thank you very much. We went way over, but does anyone have questions or comments?
Questions? I think at the beginning you mentioned something about working on an AI diagnostic framework.
Yeah.
Is that a way of like reverse engineering?
No, so from a privacy perspective, so basically how do we take, it's really an AI privacy tool. So how do we take a privacy lens to AI and make sure that we're addressing AI specific issues where there's a privacy overlap. So it's more, because more and more what all of our clients often actually they turn to their chief privacy officers asking for help, and then the chief privacy officers come to us and say like, I don't know what I'm doing, because inevitably they're going to be using AI in their business, and it's going to involve humans in some way, and so personal information. So,
Question from the chat. Any interesting beginner-friendly newsletters to subscribe to for news on AI and privacy? And I think you had a couple of things that we can share in the slides. Was there anything that?
Yeah, I mean, I actually like the markup a lot, because I find the markup and Wired actually have some really easy readable articles. So if you subscribe to their newsletter or you just check in on their website or follow them on their socials, there's always some interesting story. So you'll see if you were at my last presentation, I used the markup quite a lot too. And they're not for profit. They're not doing this just for clicks. Yeah.
Thank you for your presentation.
Welcome.
So I also have a question that with all of these problems or pros and cons about these AI models, we're all going to use it. And so the point is that we cannot always blame the company or the development team about these things. I also see the problem with the lack of regulations regarding that. But I don't know about the regulations in privacy, but for example, for autonomous vehicle or connected vehicle or the machine learning models that you want to use for that, there isn't much regulations in English, and you can find only one version in Chinese. And if you have some Chinese person in your team, you can end up finding 4 regulations about the whole project that you want to do. So what's the situation?
Yeah, so interestingly, so soon there will be, because the EU AI Act is quite comprehensive, and it doesn't just deal with privacy related issues around AI. We have Canada also has tabled draft legislation called AIDA. It's been subject to a lot of criticism because it has a lot of stuff left for regulation, so that doesn't really help us. Again, there are already things that are happening and have happened from the privacy and data protection world. So there was the European Data Protection Board published an entire opinion on connected vehicles and data protection and getting it right and stuff. So and there have been other connected vehicles that have been ordered to delete their data and so on. So on the vehicle side, there have been some things that have come out specifically because I've been tracking new AI legislation. There are also a lot of frameworks as well. So I guess my question right back to you is it because you're trying to advise on that issue, or you're trying to make sure that as you're working on this, that you're developing it with safety in mind?
You're following the regulation for that. But my question was for more for the privacy side. Your presentation was what's the situation of the regulations?
Yeah.
In Canada, I think it was less than months ago that it was an agreement that make businesses and companies responsible for the generative AIs that they're going to develop.
It's a voluntary code. Yeah, it's a voluntary code, and again, one that they kind of snuck through and got a lot of people annoyed because they didn't do the usual thing. Yeah, so that's voluntary. So that's up to a company to volunteer to do that, in the same way any other voluntary code would exist. But getting back to connected vehicles, there have been decisions based on connected vehicles. The CNIL in France has been very active on anything to do with telemetry. Often the cameras, so Illinois has in the US has really strict, they have one of the strictest in the US biometrics laws. And so they've gotten businesses into trouble for having inward facing cameras that are doing facial recognition and analysis and making decisions, because from an employee privacy perspective, that's problematic. And then also in terms of the people outside as well. And so there are things that are happening. And I mean, there are a bunch of other examples too, but I'm trying to think off the top of my head where they've gotten in trouble for just holding on to that data or not letting people know what's happening or exercise their rights as well. Yeah, I mean, guardrails, you absolutely do. And I think, yeah, absolutely, I'm in favor of regulating it. I think the problem is that we saw this isn't a new thing. People need boundaries, right? There was a time when if you were selling food that was meant to be eaten by, people, consumed, like things like milk, basic things like milk or cheese, or I'll go non-dairy, whatever, vegetables, and there was no sort of food safety requirement around it or anything else. Companies were doing things like filling the milk with chalk. Like you never knew what you were going to get. And the best you could do was maybe sue them in tort law in court. Like it's just not a very practical way to do things. So now it's highly regulated, and you have to have a nutrition label that says what's in there. And now we go even further because of allergies and things like that. So there are right now, there's actually examples of AI model nutrition labels and model cards and other examples for different audiences. So if you want to deploy AI in your in one of your products or in your own company, the nutrition label is supposed to tell you what it's appropriate for and what's not appropriate for, right? So this is appropriate for recruitment, but it's not appropriate for performance evaluation because we didn't train the model that way. Things like that, to sort of a quick fix. So yeah, I'm absolutely in favor of regulation. I don't like regulation that pretends to be regulation and then leaves everything else up to one minister's discretion to tell you after the fact. I think that sets us up for some undue influence, backdoor lobbying influence, and a lot of other things. And frankly, it's not a way to run your business. So I think the EU is on the right track. There are challenges. What we have more of than regulations is standards. There's AI threat modeling that you can do, right, to identify potential threats. In the same way we do security threat modeling and privacy threat modeling, you can do AI threat modeling. When it comes to things like human-centered AI or alignment with human values and all of this stuff, that's also very loaded, and we have to be very careful about that because whose values, right? So there are a whole host of papers written from people all around the world talking about, how you would talk about values that are important in AI. And so it shouldn't just be what Silicon Valley thinks is valuable, which is something like profit maximization. Because profit maximization justifies you doing things like stuffing milk with chalk, right? Or putting lead in paint, who cares the consequences? Or taking somebody, the companion driver out because you think you can get away with it. So if you're in a society where people have a strong sense of responsibility, then you don't have to regulate them as much. But if they don't have those internal guardrails and they're just going to do whatever they can get away with unless you tell them they can't do, then you have to micromanage them, unfortunately, a bit. I don't think micromanage, but have some outcomes based, very principled approaches to regulation.
I have a two-part question. I'm struggling to how I would frame it properly. But,
Maybe we can ask Bard or something.
but it's more along the lines of algorithms. So like when you look at the internet right now, everything kind of has that Google tint on it, and that's essentially websites learn to build themselves in the image that will score them high in the algorithm. Much into the same way that sorry, I lost my train of thought. It's
SEO, maybe?
no,
Search
not
engine
necessarily SEO, but do you think 10 years from now we will find out that the divisiveness in politics or the I'm trying to think of some of the like Instagram has been known to cause depression in young females, or I'm trying to think about these other examples. Do you think we'll find out 10 years from now that these were the unintended consequences of letting so much of our life be governed by algorithms?
We don't need to wait 10 years. We've been we were talking about it 10 years ago, right? Or 5 years ago. So if you look at some of the declarations by there's a global, now it's called the GPA, but they used to have a really long name, but it was the International Council of whatever, Data Protection Authorities. They were talking about this back then, right? So yes, absolutely. You can trace a direct line by someone's YouTube video watching habits of them going down a rabbit hole. And there have been entire studies on this. You just feed them something, it gets worse and worse and worse, right? With TikTok, you know, the whole emo thing. So if you like a song or you like a video that's kind of sad, well, then they give you one that's sadder and sadder and sadder, and it just gets worse and worse. So so I always tell my kids, like, don't just follow the recommendations, or turn the recommendations off and see what happens, right? Or don't log in and see what happens. So there's plenty of evidence already to show that happens. The same with micro-targeting, political micro-targeting. You can do things now that you couldn't do before at such an amplified pace. And one thing I think that is particularly dangerous when it comes to things like deep fakes and then polarized views is the more polarized you get in your views, the more that becomes the model, and everything you see and everything that you encounter has to be bent to fit into that model for you to believe in it. So you will see an image, if it's from somebody who you trust or you like, or if it fits a narrative, or what we call it, you could just say a heuristic, right? A mental shortcut. Then you will say, yeah, I believe that happened and that person did it and whatever else. But if it doesn't fit your heuristic, then you'll find every way to say, oh, but it's not real, or it hasn't been verified. And we probably had arguments with your neighbors or your friends or your family about this, I'm sure. And so when people but before it was some people getting radicalized, but now it feels like people are really just, they've got that heuristic, and they already know, because there are deep fakes out there, there's manipulation of media, there's misinformation, and they can't be bothered, or they don't have the informational foundation from the past, especially historical knowledge about historical knowledge. A lot of us lack a sense of history and geography, and so we just have this paradigm or this heuristic, and everything fits into it. So I feel like now, yeah, you can absolutely trace a straight line, and you can see in people's feeds who's getting what. And it's not just a matter of being in sort of silos, but being in your own very personal silo.
Do you, like, I know there's court cases or court challenges to the Supreme Court of the States trying to hold these platforms accountable.
Mm-hmm.
Do you think any of those will be successful?
They could be, but more likely, once again, it's going to be the EU that's faster with that. So there's the Digital Services Act that regulates large platforms like Twitter and Facebook, well, now X and Meta, and others that are on a list. And so already X has been subject to a number of sanctions under the Digital Services Act, specifically for what they're doing with disinformation. So not taking it down or amplifying it. And you can look at the algorithm and you can see. That's the beauty. Sometimes when I say your model will tell on you, there are unwanted audits that are going to happen by people who are good enough and smart enough to be able to deconstruct and reverse engineer. You can see bot activity, and you can watch how news spreads, and you can map it like a heat map, and you can see sort of where it originated. And often it goes back to a handful of accounts, and all their job is to just game the algorithm. and they just game it. And then it amplifies certain news. And when you don't have content moderation, and when you do the sorts of things that Elon Musk did, he fired everyone who was supposed to be responsible for this. Even Microsoft fired their AI ethics team. Like, they want to rush to market. We're the roadblocks. We're saying go slow. Nobody wants to hear that, right? So yeah, sadly it is. And that's why it goes back to when I say, like, stay frosty, I really mean it. Like, read broadly. Don't just read the things that are recommended to you. We have a number of different social media platforms that are around, and one that I really like is Spoutable. I don't know if any of you are on Spoutable, but the guy who started it is the one who created Bot Sentinel, which is a bot that detects bots on Twitter. And he's really concerned about disinformation and, you know, data mining and surveillance capitalism and this kind of stuff. And so he's actually designed the platform so that it doesn't use attention monetization or targeted advertising as a monetization model. He's trying to go for a subscription model. We'll see how that goes. It's tricky because they're not really. And then also you have the option of turning news off altogether so that you don't get news outlets in your feed at all if you don't want to. Or you can, you know, it's got a number of controls and parameters that you can use. And then what you get in your feed, it's not so with Mastodon as well, it's not an algorithm deciding because they've profiled you that this is what you should be reading, right? So that gives you the opportunity based on who you've chosen to follow to kind of stumble upon stuff.
When they profile you, does it become a type of biometric? Like, they have what you know, yeah, it's like what you like becomes the identifier for yourself.
Yeah, so we do talk about very rich profiles. Location tracking is one that can really reveal a lot about a person, but actually we do use the term fingerprinting, not for profiles so much, but we use it for things like your online activity, right? So you can triangulate a number of different data points. So what kind of device the person was using, the screen, the fonts, even the fonts, right? And obviously there's all the cookies and all of that kind of stuff, the browser type. So you start to see them repeat over and over again, and you can say with certainty that this is the same person. And that's how we do some targeted or like cross-site tracking and targeted advertising. But that's happening also between the offline world and the online world with mobile location tracking, because we have basically our own spy in our pocket, right? And then that data is used for various reasons. But really, the harm doesn't have to come from someone knowing that you are you. The harm is often knowing that you fit into a certain category, and then they've decided that this is what someone in a certain category should like and should want, and then govern you accordingly. And if actually there's a really good talk by Timothy Snyder, and he's a historian, he's not a specialist in this area, but he was using the example of how, like, today, basically you take me and compare me to a bunch of other people who are kind of like me, and then you break us down to the lowest common denominator, and then you put me into that box and you say that that's what I am, and therefore, like, my reality, my digital reality, is going to be shaped by who you think I am. So if you think I am a low income person who's struggling and can't, is going paycheck to paycheck, I'm going to get more ads, or I'm going to find in my neighborhood more of these predatory payday loan places, right? Or if you think that I'm the type of person who would not be good for this job, you're going to make sure that I don't get job. You just don't even want me to apply for your job. Or there can be positive things too, like you assume something and then you get a candidate who looks like the candidates that you had 10 years ago. The world has moved on, and now you're getting candidates who aren't fit for the job because your algorithm was looking at historicals and not really and was assuming the past is prologue for the future, but it isn't, because so that's Amazon. If you don't know what I'm talking about, Amazon got into trouble for that because they weren't hiring any women, and then even some men who were qualified, they weren't including them because they didn't fit the profile that was created before. So all my answers are long to your short questions. I'm sorry, but are there any other questions?
You briefly mentioned TikTok voice harvesting.
Yeah. Oh my gosh, voice is a whole other thing. When someone steals your voice now, they really steal your voice. So TikTok, they caused a big uproar because I think they were already doing it, or they were already planning on creating voice prints, because they're getting so many videos, right? All of these things. And so they had to update their privacy notice. And it was when they updated their privacy notice to account for, because they were sanctioned, there was a regulator who said, you didn't mention this in your privacy notice. Then they mentioned it in their privacy notice, and then people saw it and they flipped out. Kind of like what happened with WhatsApp. Like WhatsApp was already doing stuff, but then they were forced to be transparent and people flipped out, right? Which is a good case for transparency. So I don't know exactly, TikTok has to behave differently depending on which jurisdiction it's in, right? So the rules can be stricter. So in Quebec, for example, they're very strict on biometrics, and there's a special set of rules that apply. But more and more across Canada, if you look at the Clearview AI decision, and there have been a number of other biometrics related decisions, we're all coming to a consensus, whether it's an interpretation of the law that applies or specific rules that apply, that biometric data is very special and we have to be circumspect about how we use it, and voice data is biometric data. So your bank, for example, so there have been situations where in some cases we don't want there to be fraud. We do worry about financial theft. We do worry about those sorts of things. And so for authentication, to say, yes, you are you, that's a situation, that's the kind of scenario where many regulators have said, if you've got the right protections in place, you're not storing raw biometrics, you're doing X, Y, and Z, and you're being transparent and you give people an alternative, that's a use case we would be okay with. But it's, when I talked about necessity and proportionality, it's like the trade-offs, right? So is there a less invasive way, or is this really even that important? To have my voice biometric to be able to let me get into the gym so I can pump iron, like, why would you need my biometrics for that? True story. Okay, so there have been cases where they wanted to take people's fingerprints, for things like, so you can be at a theme park and you don't have to carry your wallet around and you can just pay using your biometric. Those are not use cases for something that is immutable, that you can't change, like a password. That is not a good use case for a biometric.
So when you're doing your TikTok video song, use an auto-tuner.
You can, there are voice wobblers or things you can do that make it sound similar, and similar with image as well. There are things that will kind of create a synthetic image that looks very much like yours to the naked eye, but that doesn't actually isn't exactly your biometric measurements. So in terms of it being an actual biometric, because it's computational, right? Like it's mathematical. So there are things like that you can use. It tends to be more corporate, for corporate use, like I don't know how much is available to the consumer. There's an example here, this face does not exist, that shows you, it can create a synthetic face. So some of you have probably seen it, but it also has some educational material on there. So it has little quizzes where you can guess, there are two pictures side by side and you have to guess which one is fake and which one is real. And then they give you tips to look for things like little giveaways that show you. So apparently it doesn't do very well around the ears sometimes. You can spot little things. So this kind of critical thinking and just training yourself to be able to tell the difference is going to go a long way. What we don't want to do is get to a point where we think there is no truth, that there are no facts, because then we're really in danger. So, and on that happy note,
Thank you very much.
you're welcome.
Which episode of Black Mirror do you think is most likely to happen?
All of the above.